So with clearances, we need to address where is the heat going. With older, less efficient stoves, most of the heat was going up. It was radiating off the top of the stove and mostly off of the pipe. With newer stoves, we have a whole different situation. The stoves are, by nature of their being more efficient, they're pushing more of the heat into the room right off of the stove itself. So now we have to worry about the walls around the stove. We have to worry about materials that are stored near the stove, furniture, and most importantly, the floor. The biggest difference between old and new stoves is the heat that's driven down. It's become much more important to have proper hearth protection underneath the stove. Heat comes off a stove in two different ways. There's radiant heat and there's convective heat. Convective heat, you'll see a separate jacket around the stove and oftentimes a fan that allows us to distribute the heat more aggressively. The disadvantage of a convective stove is that it's pushing all the heat up into the air, and then we need to drive it back down again. We mostly use convective stoves when we're trying to heat multiple rooms because we want the advantage of pushing that heat around. More often than not, though, you're going to have stoves that are radiant heat. Radiant heat is a very comfortable heat. It distributes around the room very evenly. However, it also results in buildup of heat in all the materials around it. So we have to make sure that we keep the stove a safe distance from those materials. When we talk about clearances, we're talking about clearances to either combustible or non-combustible surfaces that are adjacent to the stove. Combustible surfaces are basically anything that you would typically see in household construction. So wood walls, sheetrock walls, furniture, the wood that's stored anywhere around the stove, and underneath the stove. Non-combustible doesn't come into play very much in households because you rarely have a house that is completely stone or non-combustible material all the way through. The reason that we don't accept composite walls as non-combustible is because of how heat affects these surfaces. Over time, a stove that's been running fairly steadily is going to radiate that heat to the adjacent combustibles. That heat is going to transfer over time through the wall. So even though the nearest surface may be non-combustible, it may be stone or something, that heat is going to drive through that stone. That heat wants to go to cold, so it's working its way to the outside. Eventually that heat will get to the combustible surfaces within the wall. Therefore, we don't consider composite materials to be a non-combustible surface. Concealed combustibles are often the most dangerous. When we can't see them, we don't see the changes in the material, we don't see early signs of ignition, we don't see the materials breaking down, all of the things that would normally be a warning sign if it was visible that the stove is producing too much heat, that the surface nearby is getting too hot. Inside a stove, what happens is wood is broken down into a gaseous form, and the gases are what actually burned off. Pyrolysis can also happen very slowly. If you see an old piece of wood in the desert that sometimes looks like it's been charred, it may actually have just changed very slowly because of the temperature from the sun. This also happens to the walls around you. Sometimes people will say, when I go and take a look at an installation and point out that the clearances really aren't what they should be, the answer is, oh, it's been fine. It's been like that for about a year or so. What I have to point out is that slow pyrolysis can happen over many years of use. And what happens is as the wood changes its physical properties, the ignition temperature lowers and lowers and lowers. So while initially a piece of wood will need about 451 degrees to actually ignite, possibly even more if we have to drive all of the moisture out of it first, over time that ignition temperature can actually drop and drop and drop to the low 300s, which means that once we hit that really low ignition point, all it takes is one very aggressive heat burst to possibly ignite that surface. One of the stories that I like to tell to point out the issues of clearances to combustibles, and particularly concealed combustibles, dates back to some of the early days of modern high-efficiency stoves. An employee at a manufacturer had taken a large wood stove home to their old farmhouse in Vermont, and they replaced an old potbelly stove that had been there for many, many years before. They left the stove on the initial installation, which was a stone floor underneath the stove. And it had been there for almost a season, burning pretty aggressively. They were testing the stove, so they were using it fairly aggressively. He came home one day to find a hole in his living room floor. And the reason was that he'd taken some things into account as far as the installation was concerned. One was that the stone floor wasn't stone all the way through. It was actually stone laid on top of existing timbers. And these were old timbers, for one thing. The house had been built in the 1700s. The other thing they hadn't accounted for is that the stove was driving a lot of heat down. So over the course of that season, that aggressive heat driving down had slowly broken down the properties of the wood underneath the stone, underneath the stove. Eventually what happened is that wood just gave way. He was very fortunate because when he came home, all he came home to was a big hole in the living room floor, as the stove had broken a water main on its way into the basement. Otherwise, he would have come home to no house.